now then on the robot. So welcome. This is going to be on control setup, system setup, configuring stuff, using the CAN bus, configuring the radio on your robots and stuff. Just general information on here. If you have questions, please let me know. Everybody can chime in. You can use your mic. You can just in the chat window, I'll try and catch as we go here. So if you haven't known me, I am the lead mentor for 7068, and I mentor other teams in the area as well on electrical and programming stuff, and also do controls work during events. So part of this presentation was a CSA1, which is Control System Advisor on the regional events, champs, districts, and what have you on here. We're the people with the orange hats. If you don't know us, we're the ones that come to your pit and help you out, troubleshoot stuff when you have issues, or if the FTA on the field thinks you need help because something happened during a match, they'll contact us as well. So just a little bit of information on here. Also, we're going to do firmware checks on here, make sure you're up to date on there, and I'll be using the CAN bus through CTRE stuff. So it's critical that we follow the rules first for the year and everything's loaded up right. Imaging the RoboRIO and stuff. And so I always like to ask, so if you put in the chat window, if you've done any of these things, imaged the RoboRIO, configured the radio, did anything with CAN bus with the setting IDs and stuff like that, you want to put that in the chat window or say, hey, this is my first year, I've never seen this stuff before. It's just nice to everyone in the chat window just put in there what you experienced. If you don't have any experience, let us know. I like to hear from you guys so I know who's all on here, if you've even seen some of this stuff before. So chat window, or to shut up. So okay, so a lot of I'm seeing is your first time even looking at this stuff. So all this stuff's going to be applicable to what you're going to do if we ever get back together and can do all this stuff. So some of the answers you'll get is how to configure the radio. It's usually the same every year, but we'll go through the configuration utility on that. A little bit on the driver station control, so configuring and showing you some of the controls that you use during the match. So a little big debug, tips and good practices, troubleshooting stuff that I've seen throughout the years. So again, I am Todd Kruse, lead mentor for 7068 and also 4607. I do some electrical and new team legacy 8516. I'm going to be help mentor the coach there and mentor the team there, get them going as a rookie year this year. This is my 8th season with First. My son got me involved with this back in late 2003, going into the 2014 season there. And I kind of stepped back and didn't do much, and then he really got me hooked on this. And again, I've been one of the major drivers of some of those jumpstart events because I think training is important, as well as your career in the future, networking and just learning stuff and how things do things. Because here at Delta, where I work, everything is applicable to what First does and what I do in my daily job. So I'm excited to be presenting again this course here on here. Is something I usually do every jump start in December. So we kind of talked about it. First Control System Advisor is a volunteer who assists robots from teams that are having issues on the field. We work with the First technical advisors and robot inspectors to get everyone on. So our goal is to help everyone get on and have a great experience at the regional and during the competition. So we are floating all around from the pits to the field, and we're just there to help you guys in any way we can with coding, troubleshooting electrical, programming issues, or anything that may come up on your robot. So this again, just we do different training, and we're really actively with the training. And we just to put out there, you're in a typical build season. We just don't just do this jump start and walk away. We have our own site that has stuff in GitHub and variable training tools, and that's what the Jumpstart for Robotics website's can become, is a place that you can go rewatch these videos, or you can go and get some of the documentation and to reach out if you need help during the build season as well. So I just want to throw that out there. We're not here to abandon you after this training and say good luck. We want to be engaged and help you out during the season as well. So let's get into imaging your RoboRIO. So most of you have not seen this at all. There's some documentation that you need to have. FRC docs is a good place to start for some of this information. But every season when it kicks off, after the kickoff season, they give you the code to look at the game manual. There also is a full release of the software for the year. And so this the FRC update suite. It has Java, LabVIEW, and C++ libraries and everything available. So to do some of the stuff, you need to have everything downloaded and ready to go. So the RoboRIO has one method to update the image. So if you're not familiar, the RoboRIO has two ports on it. It has an Ethernet port on it, which you'll see right here. In the middle here, it's got the green and the amber light on here. When you plug it in, it shows network connectivity on here. And it has this USB adapter on here. It's printer cables, an A to B USB connected to the RoboRIO and then to your computer, your driver station, or your own laptop, wherever you're at. So once you power that up, you can be able to find it. So there's some people that have tried to do it through Ethernet. It is not recommended imaging it. I always say use the USB cable. So if you're having trouble with your RoboRIO during a competition, that's the first thing I like to check. I always bring a cable with me. But if your team does not have a USB A to B cable, I recommend getting one, because that's the only way to truly go into the RoboRIO and find out what's going on if you're having Ethernet issues on your robot. So let's get into imaging it. So if you're not knowing what an image is, the first will put an image every year on there. And what that does is puts everything on the RoboRIO that you can access through programming. The Java, C++, the LabVIEW stuff. It has everything on there that your program can deploy onto the RoboRIO that can communicate with all the hardware on there. Your digital I/O, your analog inputs, your RS-232 connections, your IMUs on there if you're using some type of gyro or other means of communicating different things on there, or a USB camera. Everything is down there ready for you to use after you do this image tool on here. Once you install the software, this icon will appear on your desktop, the RoboRIO imaging tool. So let's take a look at what that is. So after it launches, it will come up to this window here, and it has different things on there. So if you're connected to the robot, it's powered up, and your computer can identify it, you'll be able to connect to it. And it'll come up and it'll give you the information. It'll tell you what your robot is. It'll give you your MAC address, the IP address. It'll tell you what the current image is. So every year, FIRST likes to go with the same syntax on here. I'll say FRC, RoboRIO, _ and the year. This year will be 2021. This is screenshots from a couple years ago on 2018, and it'll also give you a version number. So sometimes during the building season, FIRST finds other bugs, and they will come back and say, hey, use this update. So then you go down, update to the software through the downloader, install on your PC, then you can go back in here if something fails. So also it'll tell you what the firmware version of the RoboRIO is. Now FIRST and NI, so National Instrument, is the one that does the housekeeping of everything on that RoboRIO. They design the hardware, they put the firmware on there. Once in a while there's a reason to update the firmware, and I'll show you that as well on here. So what's critical on here is you can edit the startup sequence. You don't want to do that. You'll want to format target. So if you're not going to do firmware, you say, yeah, I got the same firmware. I want to do format target. And what you have to do is make sure you put the right team number in. So we are 7068. So I would type 7068 into that window. And then I would put in here, enable and apply, and then I would hit start. So on the next screen here, I'll show you the rest of it here. So here's the bubble letter, right? Number one, make sure the RoboRIO is selected at the top. It's very rare that you'll have more than one, because if you use a single point connection, you won't have that issue. Always find the RoboRIO that you're trying to image. Now, if there's any terms anyone doesn't understand or you want me to reiterate, just let me know. I can explain a little further. So 2 is to select the target. We want to do format target. So basically it's going to wipe it out. It's like taking your hard drive on your laptop, format C:, and what it's going to do is it's going to wipe everything out. Now, what this is going to do is wipe that out, but also add a new one in there. So make sure, again, you put your team number in there, because the team number, as we find out later in the presentation, means something. And it's very critical for the connection. Then you're going to select the latest version. Now, First does a really good job here and would always put the file location automatically in here. So you don't have to go search for it. You'll automatically go to the right file structure on your Windows system and find the right file. And then you would click reformat and begin the process. During this process, you'll see the scrolling format robot target down here. And this is something you do not want to disturb while it's doing it. You don't want to power cycle it. You don't want the power to even go out. You don't want your USB connection to drop out on your laptop as well, because any of these number of things could corrupt it. And once it gets corrupted, it takes a few steps to get it recovered correctly, but it is possible. So once the image completes, the dialog will come up and say, hey, the RoboRIO was successfully updated. The IP address is the 172.22.11.2. Now keep that IP address in your mind because it's important later on in the presentation. I'll explain why. So you must deploy code. So if you had code on your RoboRIO and you deployed it and were using it in the driver station and playing around with your robot and you did a RoboRIO, here's what's important. Now you must re-download your application, because why? We reformat, right? We wiped everything out and put all new libraries on there from the latest image. Once in a while, if I say it gets corrupted, here's why. So if it gets disturbed, you'll get this nasty little message box that comes up and you'll be like, hey, what in the world does this mean? It says unable to download image to target, unable to complete the background because of the falling error. And it gives you this nice long error that who knows what, right? The programmer knows that programmed this utility knows what that error is. What it really means is you need to start over, okay? Shut it down and restart it back up and see if it comes up. There may be a case where you have to go into safe mode. So you'd press the button on the RoboRIO to bring it into safe mode. We'll show you that in a minute as well. So then you have to run the target again. And if all else fails, you can go to the NI website. They've redone it. And I can show you that at the end of the presentation. They've redone it and did a little help with that technical help as well. And then NI, if you call them, they're very useful and very helpful and can walk things over the phone with you if you just can't get. So here's some things to keep in mind. Make sure the firewall is off. Anyone know how to set the firewall on your PCs? Anyone know what the firewall does? Anybody? Anyone turn the firewall off on your PC? On your driver station, it's kind of critical to do that. I see some head shaking now. Firewalls, you should make sure they're off. And I can show you at the end, so we'll just put in the chat. If you want me to show you, I can show you on their firewall. All right. But usually Windows 10 and that will give you this little smart little window come up if it's enabled. And this is always an issue. So what sometimes the issue is you get these computers from school, and the Chromebooks won't work for this, to be honest. But your driver station sometimes will be locked down by the school administrator, you know, and they don't like opening it up for nothing. So usually we need to make sure your coaches or your teacher from the school, the administrator that can have administrator rights to go in there and turn it off if it's an issue. That'll be one thing. Update the firmware. Sometimes it will tell you need to update the firmware. So on the other case, you would go in there and select the firmware on there. So that's what this is. Sometimes I would recommend, and if I do this, and this is how I teach it in my team, is I always do the firmware first. If it's outdated, you click on the firmware button there, and then it will automatically go to your Windows file system and go find all the selected firmware in there. Most times if you have a fresh install, you only have one version of the firmware. If you're like some of us have been around for several years and you uninstall and reinstall the new 21 package for this year coming up in January, sometimes these uninstallers don't uninstall everything from the directories if they exist. So then you might have more than one firmware in here. 6 has been the latest firmware version out there that you should put in there. So I'm the type of guy who likes to say, always use the current firmware unless it's broken and I find issues, or I read about issues in the FRC community blogs. So select the firmware update and you'd click on the right one and you see the extension is a CFG file. You'd click on that and then you would update. So update your RoboRIO firmware. Enter the IP address. So this is very critical. With the USB adapter that you plug in, it makes a network adapter. A lot of people don't know this. But what it does, once you install this installer from First and NI package here, it installs a driver on there. And what it does is you plug that USB cable into it, and it immediately will go in there and your network adapters, create a new adapter. It takes the USB to a network and it'll create this network adapter that you can connect through. What it's trying to do is Ethernet, right? Even though it's USB. But in the Windows COM area, Windows is going to treat it as a network adapter. Here's some things. So everyone knows your team number, right? You know what your number is. I'm 7068. 7068, you can do what's called a local connection by typing RoboRIO in there and dash your team number. In my case, it'd be 7068-FRC.local, and that can connect to the RoboRIO, or I can put the IP address in there. So different ways of doing it. And anyone, this gets into heavy networking stuff in there, but if you do this, you can go look at the RoboRIO. Now, not many people are using Internet Explorer anymore. And in those that have the common browsers on there, it has Chrome, it has Microsoft Edge on there. Edge does not work on there as well. And the reason I bring this up is you can go look at it. It's got what a web server in there running. Does anyone know what a web server is? Anyone seen these on your devices? A web server, you guys? A web server basically brings up some utility that's running on that device, hardware on here. And you can see on the screenshot here, you can pull that up. So you can either put the IP address in at 172, the 22.11.2, or you can put the RoboRIO and your team number in there, and which is what? It's like a domain name on there. You can put the name in there and do it by name type instead of IP address on there. I know it might be a little confusing on there, but the main point is I want you to just get familiar that, hey, this is possible to do. And at some point you can connect to a board and test this out yourself to get used to looking on here. And the reason we do this is we can see what the RoboRIO is assigned to. And we're going to get into the specifics here in a moment when we get into the radio configuration to show you why that's important to go into the RoboRIO and see what the gateway is, what the IP address is in there and everything. So before we go into that portion, we're going to go into the Phoenix stuff, which is the across the road electronics portion. So is there any questions about imaging your RoboRIO and the firmware loading on that? I know at first it's very confusing, can be overwhelming at first, but I just want to point that out that there is help out there for that stuff. Does anyone know what the FRC docs are? I'm going to post that in the chat there. FRC docs has a lot of cool stuff in there. So if you see that in the chat window, everybody? and specifically some of the stuff I talked about is at this link I'm going to put in there next, right? So in the link here this is where you can go right to the RoboRIO imaging tool, and explains a lot the same stuff I just went over. Okay, so first, if you're new to first thing I want you to know is don't get overwhelmed, because there's a lot of information out there, a lot of good documentation. There's teams just like myself and mentors that put a lot of different information out there, put their own spin on there, different ways of looking at stuff. And the FIRST community has a good FRC docs, online docs that has a lot of this information in there. So take a look at them links as well. Any questions? There was one about, I have put the radio and RoboRIO on the robot, but I don't know how it works. Okay, well, hang on to that question. We're going to get there soon in the presentation. Okay, so the other thing is, anybody use or know if your team uses Talon SRXs? Or even if you're not using a Talon SRX or the Falcon New 500, you still need this. So, yeah, okay, my team does, Cameron says, all right. So how do we configure that? How do we get that CAN bus? So if you didn't know, this Phoenix Diagnostics you're seeing on my screen here is by CTRE, and they put this Phoenix diagnostic tool out here, and this is how you're going to configure everything. So by default, when you plug all these devices in there, and this could be your PCM module, your pneumatic control module, it could be a Talon SRX, it could be a Pigeon, an IMU that you might be using on your RoboRIO, it might be a CAN encoder, it might just be the Falcon 500, or your power distribution point. So we'll go define all that here in a minute, but here's one tool that you'll need to use to set this up. And again, why did I go so much on that IP address? Because this utility uses that same thing. And yes, you can get through Ethernet, but my preferred method is always use a USB to the Ethernet adapter in Windows. So if you can look at my screen down here, it says lost communication, right? And what is that IP address again? It's going to 172.22.11.2. Okay, that's what the RoboRIO is using on your adapter to find the RoboRIO. So it's important you understand that if you can't get things connected, that this is what it's doing. So on this utility, the first thing you want to do after you image your RoboRIO is you want to come in here and install the Phoenix Library and Diagnostics. Why, you say? Why would you think that would be important? Because if you don't put that in there, you're not going to be able to communicate to any other devices. So when I say you put the image on there, let's define what we put on there. The first thing we put on there is just all the first stuff for NI to communicate with itself. The hardware, your analog, your digital, all your settings in that thing are put in there with the firmware, and the portal to do what? Is to communicate with your software. So your application, your Java program, your LabVIEW program, or your C++. Python's another one, not fully supported with FIRST, but a lot of teams have been using it. It's gaining popularity on there, but it's not fully recognized as one of the 3 or the 4th language of FRC robotics. So after you do the RoboRIO image, the other thing you want to do, and I would argue this would be before you put your application in there, is you should install these Phoenix libraries and diagnostic tools, or else you won't be able to communicate with them. And them are all considered third-party API and tools to use to program your robot. So when you come in here, looks like one of my slides is out of order for some reason. This is the firmware location, in this case you were wondering if you did want to find it manually. It is in the National Instruments shared folder, firmware, CRIO, and this F6, F2 folder here under there. That's where the latest firmware is. Updating your firmware on your devices. So every device you put on your robot has a firmware version that runs that piece of hardware on there, separate from the RoboRIO. So you get your RoboRIO, that's the main brains of your whole robot communication. It starts with the RoboRIO. Now, if you want to use that Talon device, which is a drive to run a sim motor or any other type of motor on there and add encoders and all that, you'll have to do the firmware. And what's important is the set the CAN ID. Now, I'm not going to go in depth on the programming things, but if you have specific questions, just let me know in the chat, because I know some of this information is going to be, whoo, it's way over my head. I don't understand. It's a lot to take in at first when you take a snapshot of this. So with that utility, once you connect and install the libraries and diagnostics onto the RoboRIO, you can come in here and now look here. You can scan on here. So you can see I have Talon SRXs. I have the power distribution board on here. If I had a pneumatic controller, that was set in there. So it tells you what the hardware type is and device name and the status of it, right? So down in here, what gets important in here is, because again, I got a brand new board. We just fired it up. First thing I did is I imaged my RoboRIO. I did the firmware image tool on here. Now, how am I going to talk to my rest of my devices? Well, the first step before you even get to the programming stage, and we're not even going to really talk about the programming side of the things today, but first thing we need to do is go in here. So does anyone know what the default ID is on these devices? Anyone want to take a guess at? So say I'm using 5 Talons on my robot. I got 4 motors of the drivetrain, and I have 1 motor that's going to be used for some type of manipulator. Does anyone know what the default ID is when I power that thing up? No clue. I never had a clue either until I started looking at this cluster. So here's the answer. You'll have 5 of these Talons out there, and they'll all be set to 1. How you say, that is outstanding. So how am I going to determine which one I'm talking to so I can configure it? Because these IDs are very critical to your programmer. So if you're the programmer, you'll want to know this information as well. And so there's utility in here that you can, I don't know if I have the slide in here, I have to double check. It may be up here. There's a utility on here, and you can look on the screen here actually. It has a flash, a blink on here. So the one thing you can do, sometimes you can unplug everything, right? Because if you know anything about the CAN bus, it's all daisy chained together, and you'd have to look at other presentations to get the really detailed information on there. But here is in a nutshell. There's a CAN bus with 2 wires on there, a yellow and a green wire that starts the RoboRIO, and a daisy chains through all the devices to a terminating point, that resistor that will send everything back. You could unwire everything, and so you only see 1 device at a time, but that's not necessary because this utility will allow you to do that. So you would highlight, and right here I have left motor 2 highlighted on the screen here. You see, I would click on the blink utility here, and it'll blink the LEDs on there real fast. It'll go back and forth on there. Then I go, yes, that motor right there is going to be my left motor 2, my drivetrain Kruse, right? Once I know that, I can click on it here and I can change the ID. So I can toggle this up to 2, and then I can change it, because that's the number I'm going to program in my software to talk to that CAN ID. So I can change the name of it right away. And I would do that for all my devices on there. So I would go to my right motor and I'd flash it because I don't know which one it is. And I would flash that 1 Talon on there, and I look at it and it's got green and amber lights on there that will be flashing. And it'll flash really fast and just flashing at you, and then you know. And then if you don't know, you ask someone who wired it and say, hey, where is that motor going? Which one is that wired to? Is it my front left, front right, back one, back left, back right? Which one is it? Is my manipulator? Which one it is? And then I suggest you put a real name on here, put a device ID on there. So if you come back in here, you don't have to guess and say, well, what's CAN 2? I don't know. Because it'll be all default all the time. So here it gives you the manufacturing date. It gives you the boot loader revision. These are just hardware things on the hardware revision stuff. The other thing in here then would be your firmware on here. So the firmware versions in this column right here. And again, I'm huge about using the default all the time. That is the latest and greatest firmware. And I want that because I want all the latest bug releases that the manufacturer has fixed. And I want to use features that may not be in an older version. So it's good practice to use the latest version of it. So what is cool about their new utility, before I used to have to click on each one of these and then update device, update device, update device. But in here, you can go in here and set all of them. So I could highlight it and I can say, update all the talents. And I select here, I push the button here, and you can see it goes to the user, public, documents, across the road, electronics. It'll go out and find the firmware on there, and I can click on which the newest firmware version is, and I can update them all. So you can have a device ID from 0 to 62. And so I always stay away from 0 because 0 then has a lot of defaults as well as 1. And 63 is reserved for broadcasting on the network. Any questions about that? You can select it, change the ID, change the name of it so it makes sense to you. And then you can click here and you can update the firmware by just using this utility here. And then you have it set, ready to go. So on here, it shows you, here's where the talons, I can go to any directory I want, but you're gonna look for the .crf file to the flash. That's your firmware you're gonna be loading on there. Also, you got your PCM has firmware on there, and you have a power distribution board, your PDP on there that you can use to put firmware on there. Make sure you use the latest version of that as well. It hasn't changed in a few years, so the power distribution board has been stuck at 140, and the PCM module I think is at 162 still. But you can leave these devices at 0 if you want. If you're using another PCM module, make sure you change it, because again, you only see one at a time. So when you first come on the list, you're only going to see one. It's only going to pick up the first one it finds. Once you configure it to a new CAN ID and refresh, you'll find the next one, and then the next one, and the next one, till you finally find all of them that you have wired in your system. So does that make sense to everybody? That you have to configure it or else you're not going to see them all? So anytime that you put a new one on here, you'll have to refresh it and configure it, or you won't be able to see it. You will not be able to write software to it, if that makes sense. Any questions on that? The radio configuration. Now here's how the radio is. You would plug in Ethernet to it, and you can see on the diagrams right here. So the other thing is, once you get to the regional event, first thing you gotta do is you gotta go to the robot or the radio configuration table and get your radio configured for your event. That sets all the keys and that communicate on the field. What here is, if you go back to the school after a regional event, or it's a brand new radio that you just got out of the parts, the kit of parts there on there, you will not be able to communicate to it because it won't know who you are and what your setup is to even communicate to your laptop. So here's the kiosk that will be on your desktop once you install the software for that year. You go on here and you can put your team number on there, and you can put a robot name on there. It's optional, but you can do. And in here, it also has firmware loading as well on here, and I recommend that. Sometimes if you have issues with it, you may want to just do the firmware on there. But take a note of where this is at and how to plug it in. Now, if you're using a PoE, you might want to use a different plug to plug it in, because the PoE port's on the left and not the right plug-in on there. And I always recommend, again, to do the firmware first and then configure your radio. Once you configure this, it will automatically configure it so you can connect and you can look at your Wi-Fi adapter to find it. And there's some directions on here. There's a step-by-step on here. Make sure you pay attention to it. It's right on the software on there, because it's really critical that you pay attention to the lights and the instructions on here, because these radios take almost 60 seconds to boot up. Does everyone understand that? You'll come on, but to make a connection where that Wi-Fi light is blinking here, it will not be for about 60 seconds. Usually it's about 45, 50 maybe, but almost 60 before it gets up and establishes a link. So it's very critical that you wait for it to fully boot up before you apply the configuration. If you're doing a firmware load, it's going to tell you to power cycle. So you'll start in, start a little part way, and it'll tell you the power cycle. So you'll unplug it, the power on it, and then plug it back in, and then it will dump the firmware in there before it boots up. So again, pay attention to the verbiage on the screen when you bring your software utility up there for the radio configuration. Again, these instructions right here are very critical. It'll prompt you, follow the on-screen prompting, or you'll have issues with it and you won't be able to connect with it. So this just gives you indication how to read the lights on there on your robot radio. So as we're going through this and getting questions on here and that, some people don't understand how this system works on here. So what's critical to understand is once you configure your radio, this hands out the IP address to your RoboRIO or to your USB, or not your USB cameras, but primarily your Ethernet IP cameras. Again, that hands out the IP addresses. When you're connected to the field, the field communications always is from the field management system to your radio, down to the RoboRIO, and then to your devices. It's critical to understand that, how this all bridges together. So if you're plugged into your driver station, that's plugged in and goes to the FMS, goes out through the Wi-Fi connection on the field to your radio, to your RoboRIO, to your Talon to move a motor or an actuator, or to do a pneumatic or do an output and input read. That's the way the flow is always is. The driver station here, as you see on the screen, will show you that. So in this case, again, there's that IP address again, 172.22.11.2. That's connected through the USB directly to your RoboRIO. You can see the Ethernet has a 169.254 IP address. Take note, that is a fallback address. That means it's not being assigned, because if it was signed on, in my case, it would be 10.70.68.2 would be the IP address of that RoboRIO once it's configured from the radio. Right now, it's not on this screenshot here. So there's other information on the driver station here that you can look at. It'll tell me all my current image on the Rio, the driver station, and then it will give me, in this case, it was the beta I had on there last year. It'll give you the beta library. So it'll give you the library set you have loaded on the RoboRIO. We talked about firmware a little bit. So if you go on your thing and pull up the window and you type in firewall, you'll bring this screen up here with all your firewall connections on here. And if you notice, this one will show you on the driver station if it is configured on here. So on this screen here, you would go in here and you would click off and on these firewall settings and turn them all off so they're red X. Make sense? You just go into Windows and then shut the stuff off. Usually I'll just type in firewall when I bring up the command prompt there on Windows. If you hit the Windows key, you can bring up, start typing in there. Cartesian will bring it up too, and just type in firewall, hit enter, and it'll pull this up this screen here. And then you can go and click on these and disable all these network stuff, particularly the network stuff. Most of you won't be on domain. Hopefully the schools don't put you on domain on the laptops for your driver stations, particular laptop. That's a little more difficult to get around, but your public Wi-Fi is in that. Or else sometimes they'll ask you for an exception when it starts up. So a little bit about the driver station is you got things all configured and you're using it. Some useful stuff in here is the message window in here. It tells you if you have any errors going on in here. And how many people know there's a log file all the time on every match you run or every time you hit run on your robot? Does anyone know that there's a log file in there that you can look at? Nobody? Never been seen it? It's a pretty cool thing that as a control system advisor, if you have any issues on here, we can monitor the voltage on your PDB, or you can monitor a particular channel to a drive, or you can see the overall voltage on here of what's going on. And it will let me know if you are in teleop or auto or robot was disabled. All this stuff is being logged in here, and you can see in here in the list here, it will actually see the match number on there. So if you come off the field and you want to say, all of a sudden I was having trouble, or if your drivers come back and say, hey, it wasn't responding, you can go back to the log file and say, hey, was I disconnected? Oh, it was only 20, 30 seconds I was disconnected. And that tells me that was your RoboRIO may have rebooted, right? Because RoboRIO can reboot and come right back. If you see a long period in that file where you're not connected, that's your radio being down. And it'll show you when you highlight these different things in here, you'll see that the radio went down and rebooted, and it may or may not connect at the time the match ended. So I just make you aware, not doing a full class on that, but just make you aware this is available in the driver station. Other cool things to put on there is the SmartDashboard. It's kind of being phased out slowly by FIRST, but it's a graphical face you can put on your driver station while you're in the match or doing testing on your robot. You can put these cool displays on there. You can add a subsystem in here, the distance if you're doing a PID or an encoder look. You can graph that stuff, put it in the windows and set things on there, talk to the robot. I like the Shuffleboard personally. It's the new graphic on here with the Java FX on here. And again, you could click and drag things onto the screen here, turn them into graphs, turn them in different ways displaying it, the number. I can also talk and tell the robot different set points. If I'm doing an arm manipulator to a certain point using an encoder, I can type that in. You can see my motor speeds and everything else on there. And then here's the live window that you can go into. So these are ways we can troubleshoot if something's going on. You can just put your driver station in test mode, and you look at these live windows. You can pull them up and look at everything. Very useful to go and see a motor. And if you put it in the right mode, you can actually turn on and spin one motor at a time, which is really nice. If I'm bringing a system up and I think it's all configured and I say, hey, I only want the front left motor to turn, I can come in my live window, set it up, and then I can enable it, the robot, and I can take my slider here and I can say, here's the gear mover motor that we had one year. I can slide this back and forth and hit 0 and it'll stop. But I can go, hey, when I go negative, is that motor spinning negative? Or is it positive? I do this before we even really go into teleop and test that. We go to the live mode here and we test the robot one motor at a time to check out. What am I checking for? We're checking for wiring errors. We're checking for configuration errors. Did I configure it? Am I talking to the right CAN ID, right? Again, if we don't, we have to go back into the Phoenix tuner and go to that ID and say, oh, it's a 5. What was the program in? Oh, it's got 4. Okay, that's obviously wrong, right? I'm talking to that motor. It's supposed to be CAN ID 5, not 4. So this is a way we can double check everything on here using this live window. I like the more of the dark view here. I mean, you can customize the shuffleboard and put all different things in here. So you can change the color on that. You can put your USB cameras on here, your camera connectors on here, and you can test it right away without even doing a lot of different deployments. I could add custom things to the Shuffleboard by doing some snippets of code. Again, this is not a programming class, but just show you the power of the Shuffleboard and what can be out there to help you debug and bring up your system correctly. So again, I can customize this widget, put it on there, and I can run my motor speed by this little snippet of code on here. And you can put tabs up here that you can put a live window, configuration. I can put my drive motors in there. I can create a custom window for my driver team. So I can have my cameras positioned on. If there's an auto select on there, I can add that to just a driver's view tab. So the other tabs are for the debug, the programmers, the electrical guy that wants to debug something, configuration something. I'd always have them on a different tab. I know we're kind of going fast and getting towards the end here, but you know, IP addresses is very critical on here. So I kind of said it before, but how does first set the IP address? When you're configuring all this, how do they set the IP address? It always starts with a 10 and then XXXXX what? Anyone know? I've kind of said it before on here, but does anyone know how the IP is assigned? How does first know how to set it when you configure your radio? Anybody? No one knows how to set your radio, what the IP address is? It's your team number. So think about that. So your team number, what? So put in the chat window, if we use the team number part of our IP address that first configures with the radio configuration and gets handed out to the driver station, that what would be your address if it's 10 dot whatever? Keep in mind, RoboRIO's always at the last digit is going to be a 2 all the time. Your radio will be at 1, but what would it be? Put in the chat window what your IP address would be, what you expect it to be, using your team number. Okay, good. Getting it. So we got team 6045, 7530, 3300. It'd be exactly right. So our IP addresses for my team would be 10.70.68.2 would be the RoboRIO. Remember we went and looked at that before? So I thought it was always clever. First uses your 2 digits of the first part of your team number, and the next 2 digits as part of the masking for the IP address. Again, your radio will be at 1.1. Your RoboRIO will always be .2. Even when you saw that scenario with the 172 number, 172.22.11.2. Okay, RoboRIO will always be .2. Your radio will always be .1. So the radio has a web server in there too. It's got some settings in there. I suggest not messing with it because that's what the configuration utility is going to do. It's going to configure the radio exactly what first is expecting for the competitions or to run it with the driver station and everything else. So the USB connector, that would be the 172.22.11.2 number. And then what or who assigns the IP address? I've kind of said it a couple times, but who or what device will configure the IP address? Anybody know? Who's going to assign that IP address? What's going to tell RoboRIO what the IP address is? First directly doesn't do it. There's a device that we configure that will hand out an IP address to the RoboRIO. That would be the radio, okay? The radio is going to assign the IP address from the configuration. Okay, so let's just be clear about that. when you get on the field, the field management system, the FMS system, that's controlling all the robots in the field and feeding information back to there, is gonna connect to your radio, because you're gonna plug in your driver station by a Ethernet cable at the driver station. The FMS is gonna go in there and do a bunch of crazy stuff in the background, right? It's gonna virtually map everything. It knows when you come to that station, I plug in my team, it's gonna say, hey, it's team 7068. So it's gonna know that, and it's virtually gonna sign everything in the background to this virtual network so they can control all the robots. So if you misbehave on the field and you commit a big fall, they could disable you or e-stop your robot if something happens safety-wise. But the radio is going to assign the IP addresses down. So when you're not in the field, the radio boots up. Once it boots up, the RoboRIO gets assigned that IP address. I got a lot of screens here left. I mean, we're basically out of time. Is there any questions on here? Because we can go, we have troubleshooting the RoboRIO and that. And again, I'm going to post this presentation up online. There's a ton of more. This is basically one of my presentations I do on everything, on troubleshooting everything on here. But if you've got questions, we're about ready to wrap up for the day. So I appreciate everyone attending today. And we can get into there on the cameras or .11 on there and stuff and configuring. So that was the bulk of what I wanted to talk about, was just basically imaging your RoboRIO, doing firmware, doing your CTRE stuff on your CAN devices, setting the ID, how critical that is, how you can troubleshoot that, and setting firmware. Make sure you download the firmware and stuff. There's a lot to unpack here, gentlemen. Ladies, if there's anyone on here, if you have questions and stuff, you can definitely go back to our jumpstartrobotics.org website, and all the videos will be posted on here as well as this presentation. Questions, statements, all confused? Some people say, no, you're not confused. So you're ready to configure your new 2021 robot, or basically we're using your 2020 robot. So you can take a look, and I encourage you. I always have a test board set up. Our team, we have just a simple RoboRIO and a power distribution board, and we use throttle motors. We take the little baby motors and we put them on a board, and then we use that as our training and experimenting with stuff, Shuffleboard or configuring stuff or doing different testing and stuff. And then you're able to troubleshoot stuff by pulling a wire out. What does it do? What is our expected results? Now we see if something goes red on there, is it got errors or it's got a sticky fault in the power distribution board and stuff. So that's stuff to do. Any questions? No questions? All right. You can always find us on that Jumpstart stuff there. Thank you guys. Good luck. And any questions, we'll be posting a thing again on our Jumpstart Robotics thing, that if you need help or questions or follow up or anything you come across up during the season, just email us on that, and we monitor that and get back to you and connect with you and give you the resources you need. But again, FRC docs I put in the chat is a great place to get more resources. I don't know where the moderator went, but that's basically what I have.
Great, I can see thumbs up. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. Have a great day.
Have a good day, everybody.
Perfect. All right, I'll stop sharing that.
Good. Well, Todd, was a pleasure. Super interesting.
Yep, a lot of information.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna get going. Have a great rest of your day, and yeah, hopefully see you next time.
Yep, you do. Bye.
Have a good one. Bye.